So a couple months ago, I did my first video on BBEGs. And when I made that video, I didn't think it'd be the first because I didn't think I'd talk about this ever again. But recently, I have been inspired, and not in a good way. World of Warcraft Shadowlands has concluded its story with Eternity's End, the final patch of this epic story, and it was not received well.
That was lame. Alright, could someone link?
A big reason why is because of the big bad evil guy, the villain of the campaign, or the expansion in video game terms, the villain of this expansion, the jailer, Zoval. He was not very good as a villain. People did not like him, and not in the way that you want as a villain. People thought his writing was bad. Now, I was asking myself, why? What happened here? How did we go from epic villains in World of Warcraft, like Arthas the Lich King and Sargeras? How did we go from there to this? What happened? And why does this villain suck so much? Well, I think that there are 1, compelling answers, and 2, compelling lessons that we as Dungeon Masters can take from Zoval the Jailer to create our own BBEGs and make them all the better. So, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, let's start off by asking ourselves, who the hell is this jailer guy? Who is Zoval? And that's a pretty valid question to ask, and I am going to answer it because I know a lot of you don't play World of Warcraft. Well, for starters, Zoval is a god of death. He's a lot like Sauron and Asmodeus, but not as interesting. He rules over the Maw, aka Hell in World of Warcraft, and he watches over the tortured souls. However, he doesn't want to do that anymore, I guess. He turned them into his own personal army and is now invading the mortal realm as well as the other realms of the afterlife, the Shadowlands, in search of power so that he can destroy the universe and remake it in his own image or whatever. You know, it's standard bad guy stuff. It's nothing we haven't seen before, so why did it definitely not work here? Well, for starters, that part that I just said, nothing we haven't seen before, not doing itself any favors. For starters, Zoval is bland. He has very little characterization throughout the expansion. So, what does that mean? Well, specifically by bland, I mean that his personality, there's just not much there. He's not exactly a charismatic ruler. He has a deep voice, and he says intimidating things like, "Your end has come, mortals," and, you know, stuff like that. But beyond that, like, what characterization does he have? He barks orders a lot, but again, like, where is his personality? He doesn't really have one, which, in theory, is okay. Like, Sauron in Lord of the Rings, he doesn't really show a lot of personality in the films. I don't know about the books, I haven't read the books in a hot second, but I wager there, he also doesn't showcase a ton of personality. He mostly spent the story as a giant red eye. But Sauron is a pretty decent villain. Why? Because Sauron is at the very least intimidating. In order to counteract bland, you just need to be interesting, which Zoval is not. He doesn't need to be a super charismatic Littlefinger type character in order to be interesting. He could also just be terrifyingly powerful on the level of Sauron. Cthulhu is another villain that has basically no characterization in the short story of his origin. Call of Cthulhu, he just appears and is a big monster, but a lot of people were really invested in the character of Cthulhu and the fear of this monster because the monster and his story was interesting. Whereas Zoval the Jailer just doesn't have much to him. Now, we're going to talk about that part later on down the line that is important. However, let's just stay here for now. We've got a lot to talk about. Another big problem is that Zoval doesn't have a lot of characterization. This is another super big thing for a D&D campaign. We as Dungeon Masters don't usually get a lot of time with our bad guys, and that makes it hard for us to characterize them. It's a big problem with Zoval in World of Warcraft. Zoval has very little characterization because we don't interact with him all that much. He has voice lines, but none of them really allude to much beyond the fact that he's the bad guy. So how do we mend the situation? Well, Matt Mercer has shown us how with his villain in Campaign 2. Spoiler, 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 spoiler. Lucian, the resurrected version of Mollymauk Tealeaf, is a great bad guy. A big reason why is because Lucian talked to the party. This was huge. he interacted with the Mighty Nine, and that made him a lot more interesting. We got to learn a lot about him, and we became invested in him as a character. It made the final battle against Lucian all the more impactful because we knew who he was. We understood his character. He wasn't just a nothing sandwich of imposing bad evilness that just happened to be at the end of the journey. He was a real character that was along for the ride. He was interesting. And that is the number one point of this entire tip. You need to make them interesting, whether it be through characterization, whether it be through having interesting lore, whether it be making them terrifying or monstrous. They need to be memorable in some way. They need to stand out. Zoval has all of the interest of a random bandit captain that I find at the end of the dungeon. He does not intrigue. He does not stand out, and that's a big reason why he failed. Alright, now, next point. This is going to be interesting because we just talked about how Zoval is really bland and boring. Well, World of Warcraft doubled down on that mistake by doing something else that's pretty stupid. I'm going to bring up something that's a bit strange, but we're going to talk about Eggman from Sonic the Hedgehog. When I was a little boy running through Green Hill Zone with my little controller, I thought nothing more about Eggman. Eggman is the bad guy, and he's got to go down. I know nothing about him. All I know is that I must kill, and therefore, I fought Eggman. Sonic the Hedgehog does not imply anything more about Eggman's character. Eggman is just the bad guy. There's nothing more to it than that. And I think that, especially in Dungeons & Dragons, it's okay to have a simplistic bad guy. Is it revolutionary? Is it great? Is it going to blow your player's mind? Probably not, but I went an entire campaign with pretty simple bad guys, and that first campaign was a massive success for me and my players. We did that for 2 years, and it was a lot of fun, even if the villains were simple. But if I had implied that there was more than meets the eye with these bad guys, that there was massive twists, secrets behind their motivations, and there just ended up being nothing, then yeah, I wager that my players would not be happy. Again, in Sonic, Eggman is nothing more than just the bad guy. In World of Warcraft, the Blizzard team, the writing team, they went out of their way to tell us that there was more to Zoval than meets the eye. There was mystery, there was a bit of intrigue. And that mystery and intrigue did make Zoval interesting. That is one of the ways you can make a villain interesting, with that setup. So, didn't that fix the first point? Well, I mean, if you're paying attention to the name of the first point, bland and boring, no, it didn't. Because if you tease that your villain is more than meets the eye, and don't pay that off, you're essentially doubling down on a fatal mistake. Zoval didn't have much more than what was initially shown, meaning all of that setup just ended up being very, very, very disappointing. People were speculating about Zoval actually being the good guy in this expansion. That would have been something interesting. Yeah, it wasn't great, and that resulted in a lot of people being incredibly disappointed. Look, it's okay to have simplistic villains, especially in D&D. Don't try to tease something that's not there. If you have a simplistic, big, bad dragon that just wants to burn things down, that's fine, that's great. In fact, I think that that will serve as a great villain for your campaign. But don't try to make it anything more than that. Don't tease something that you haven't planned out yet. Don't try to create disappointment with false expectations. Otherwise, you're gonna end up like Zoval. Now, the World of Warcraft team tried to make Zoval interesting with having him tie into a bunch of different big cosmic lore. But instead of making Zoval interesting, they instead just made him incredibly confusing, especially from a world building standpoint. Now, I know that somebody is thinking that this serves in contradiction to the first point, but it absolutely does not. Creating a bunch of lore connections for your BBEG does not make them interesting. Just saying that they have connections to cosmic powers doesn't mean that they're magically going to be interesting to your players. You need to actually make your players care about those lore connections. And with Zoval the Jailer, we did not. In fact, we couldn't care because it was so damn confusing to understand what was going on with this guy. Zoval is not just introduced with a bunch of new lore elements, which is just naturally going to be confusing. He's introduced with the Shadowlands and all of the elements of that realm. But on top of all that, Zoval has a confusing cosmic plan. Zoval has a bunch of cosmic elements of his plan. So many, in fact, I've done like 5 takes of this section where I tried to explain it. I don't even bother anymore because it is just way too convoluted. Zoval, the jailer, has a ridiculous amount of nonsensical information that just gives me a headache, which is not good. If you have a villain that's too simple, I think that that's okay. But a villain that's too complicated and convoluted will piss people off. It is not good. A simple villain, people can sit through the game with that. But a convoluted villain is not great. And honestly, I am guilty of this. I am guilty of creating convoluted villains. And the moment I realized that I needed to step it back was the moment one of my players asked me, wait, why do we hate this guy again? That's when I realized that I had made a dire mistake. I had failed as a storyteller. When somebody's asking me why they should dislike the villain, I've messed up, and I needed to change how I did my stories. I was writing my characters like Zoval, with a bunch of cool lore connections and convoluted plans, but those things don't make for interesting bad guys. They just confuse the players if you don't deliver them in an efficient and effective manner. And that's what happened with my game, that's what happened with World of Warcraft, and it didn't end well for WoW. Luckily for me, I managed to pull back and salvage my story and create villains that were actually interesting to the players by using the previous points. Characterization and scenes with them can fix this problem. Untangling a villain's scheme using scenes with the villain in them is really, really good. You get to characterize the villain and explain what the hell is going on. Basically, in essence, don't confuse your players. Make sure they understand what is happening, because a story they don't understand is a story they're not going to be invested in. Alright, final point. Zoval, I'm sorry, he's a Mary Sue. In fact, I think he's the definition of one. Now, a lot of people talk about Mary Sue protagonists, and I think there's a good reason why. Mary Sue antagonists go over your head, because an antagonist that just wins because they're super powerful, that's honestly kind of normalized just by principle of the fact that villains usually are more powerful than the heroes. It's a good idea, by the way. Your villain should probably be more intimidating, more imposing than your heroes. Just look at Lord of the Rings, for example. Is there ever a battle in those films or in those books where the good guys outnumber the bad guys? No, that'd be silly. The bad guys almost always outnumber the good guys because it makes the fight more interesting. There's more tension to it. And that's why Mary Sue villains usually just kind of go over the head. Villains that are very powerful, that's normal. But Zoval is so comically powerful that it's hard to take him seriously. Not powerful in like a punchy way, but in this case, he's powerful in a big brain 4D chess way. Like I said earlier, his schemes are so ridiculous that it just makes me laugh thinking about it. He has manipulated all the cosmic powers of the universe. How? I don't know, it doesn't matter. He has demons on his side that just do it because they are deceptive. Ooh. Number one, that cheapens all of the threats that players have faced before, which is not something you want to do, especially if players like those threats better than the current one. And on top of that, it just is ridiculous. Your villain can't be so comically powerful that it's almost humorous for your players to think about. They should be powerful in a way that feels a bit more real. And I know real sounds ridiculous. We're talking about Dungeons & Dragons and fantasy media here. But having them be a Mary Sue that just has a 4D chess ultra scheme that always succeeds no matter what because he's the bad guy and he needs to win, it's silly. It's stupid. And I don't really have much more to say on this topic than that. Zoval failed for all of these reasons. It starts with the fact that he's bland and just spirals all the way down into this. He went from just a bland villain to a bland villain with a confusing plan to a bland villain that just infuriatingly just kept on winning. It's not fun. And all of these things combined made for a terrible BBEG for me. It didn't help that I expect more from the World of Warcraft writing team, and I expected more from Zoval. Like I said, they teased there was more of this guy, but there wasn't. Don't be like Zoval, guys. Do not create a villain like him. I hope that these points helped you to avoid these pitfalls and these mistakes when writing BBEGs, and I hope that you guys enjoyed. If you did, then please do leave a like to let me know. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out my humongous over 120 episode RPG horror story series where we talk about the best of the worst from Dungeons and Dragons. And one time, actually, we talked about World of Warcraft horror stories, so you can check out that episode in that playlist, link in the cards. And while you're there, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of my content. If you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment worst BBEG. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.